thanks to Mr. Stick in the Spokes back here in the corner, we won't mention any names, but we had a discussion 2 weeks ago when I introduced the letter to Philippians that Paul writes. I was given a little bit of background in Philippi, and I had made a comment that Paul might have been planning some moves when he was imprisoned, and he didn't tell them that he was a Roman citizen. Because if you remember, at the end of that, he's released from prison, and they wanted to do it quietly, and Paul says, no. They arrested me, beat me, put me in prison as a Roman citizen. I'm not going quietly. And Charles made the point, and I think not only is it a valid point, but I went back and reread both the account in Acts and all of the letter to Philippians, and it completely changed the way that I read both of those accounts. So I think it's significant enough that if it changed the way that I read it, obviously it's a significant point and it's worth considering. In the end, we don't know what really happened because we weren't there. It wasn't recorded. At least this part of it, but I think it's worth mentioning and offering alternative points of view. So Charles had made the point that when somebody's arrested by the Romans, and keep in mind this is a Roman city, a very Roman city. This is a stronghold for the Roman government. It's also, I think I told you that I read it was, I forget which legion it was, the 23rd or 27th legion, I think, was stationed in Philippi at the time that Paul entered into Philippi. That was a big deal. So these were well-trained warriors and not just figureheads who were pencil pushers, so to speak. So for the charge, which we mentioned in Acts 16 last week, the charge was disruption of Pax Romana, Roman peace. And that can be found in, let's see, what verse was it? In Acts 16. Yeah, verse 20. And when they had brought him to the magistrates, they said, "These men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city." It's this disruption, this disturbance of peace. That was the charge. So Charles made the point that somebody who's arrested under the assumption that they're not a Roman citizen, this happened quickly, and especially in a Roman city, and especially in the city of Philippi where you have the 27th Legion. This happened very quickly. Paul probably didn't have time to explain that he was a Roman citizen, and so Paul would have been arrested very swiftly, and he made the point too that Jesus kind of strangely had the best case scenario. There was an arrest. He was kind of passed from hand to hand. Jesus was not a Roman citizen. And he was kind of passed from hand to hand. There was collaboration going on among Roman officials. They were trying to figure out what to do with him. Then they were asked, the crowd was asked, should we release him? And they said no.
Well, even during Jesus' trial, they gave him, albeit a false chance, but it's still a chance to explain.
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
And we don't see that as a fault.
And there was collaboration with Jewish officials, where he was not only being passed from Roman official to Roman official, but he was being passed back to Jewish officials, which is strange to me that they were even given a little bit of a say, because the Romans didn't have to do that at all. I look at that as more of a courtesy to the Jewish people, who they kind of had a semi-friendly relationship with. But that was more of a courtesy. Paul wasn't afforded any of that in Philippi. In Philippi, it was arrest him, beat him, put him in prison, stop this, snuff it out now. And you'll see the jailer's response. Remember when the jail doors flew open, what was his very first response? What was he going to do? Commit suicide. Not gather the inmates up and try to control it. His first response was suicide. Why? Why the knee-jerk reaction? Well, if you understand Philippi, where he was, this guy was dead meat, period. And so, the point is that Paul probably wasn't even afforded opportunity to explain that he was a Roman citizen. This happened very quickly. He was beaten, put in prison. And so that changes the way that I look at the story, because if you read the flow of it, Paul is not trying to explain himself to the jailer. Paul never mentioned, at least what Luke records in Acts, Paul never mentions that he's a Roman citizen until they try to release him. And so, with that being said, what does Paul try to do? And think about this. It's completely unfair. It's completely unjust. It's completely unprovoked. And this is on the heels of the Macedonian call, where Paul and his companions collaborate and say, well, what's the meaning of this man crying out saying, come to Macedonia? Well, it must be God calling us into Macedonia. When they've spent months being prevented from preaching, they've kind of been in limbo, they've been in limbo for months, traveling hundreds of miles by foot, burning up money, they're eating food, they're trying to find places to stay. This is in a region too that has kind of harsh climate in the wintertime, so it's not easy travel. And they get this call, or what they perceive to be a call, into Macedonia, and they're like, now the floodgates are going to open up. Like on the first missionary journey, you read it, and it's like, Paul's just going from city to city to city to city to city. And, even when there's persecution, Paul gets up. Like when he's stoned and left for dead on the first journey, he gets up and goes into Derbe. And people are being baptized everywhere. And like when you read it, you're like, holy cow, is this like a successful missionary journey? I mean, full of trouble for sure, but people are receiving the word. The second journey, it's like, did somebody dump molasses on the trail? They're being prevented from preaching. So now I think in their minds, they're probably like, hey, the word's going to open up. People are going to receive the word. They go into Philippi and this happens. First of all, they can't find a synagogue, right? They find this small group of women, no men present that's recorded. They baptize Lydia and her household. And then Paul and his companions are beaten and put into prison. So that changes the way that I view this, because then what happens next I think is really incredible. So verse 25 of Acts 16, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. A couple things. One, I've pointed this out many times here. They're not like, belting out these hymns. They've been beaten how many times? If you know anything about Roman floggings, how many times were they beaten? It was a very specific number. 39. 40 lashes minus 1. The scientific reasoning behind that was that it was believed that the 40th lash would be the one that kills you. And so the point was to inflict so much pain on somebody that you bring them as close to death as possible without actually killing them. They're hurting. They're barely alive, literally, physically, they're barely alive. So I envision this gruesome scene where they're bleeding out of their backs, lots of nerve damage, most likely fractured vertebrae. It's a gruesome painful, very painful scene. They're near the point of death, and they're praying and singing hymns to God. I look at the things that I complain about. Right? In ministry, let's be honest, we complain about things. We cry that things are unfair. We cry that, for whatever reason. We cry out and say, well, things aren't going my way, or, I could list a million things that I've complained about, and I read this, and I'm like, Paul had every right to complain. To God specifically. Paul earned a Job moment where Paul could cry out, be like, your arrows are always you're in the bushes waiting to attack me. You're like a lion waiting to pounce on the prey. But Paul doesn't do that. Paul's response when he's near death is to pray and to sing hymns to God. And the prisoners were listening to them. Paul wasn't saying, hey, look, I'm a Roman citizen. This is a load of BS. I want out of here. I'm gonna take down whoever's responsible for this. Caesar's gonna hear. Paul could have appealed to Caesar at this point, legally. Paul could have appealed to Caesar and probably would have won. He didn't do that. He's singing and praying, and suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's bonds were unfastened. When the jailer woke and saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried with a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And the jailer called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. What do you see interesting about this, given that alternative that he doesn't know they're Roman citizens, or doesn't know that one of them is a Roman citizen? This is a Roman jailer. What do you find perplexing about his stance towards them? Is it typical for a Roman guard to fall down at the feet of a non-Roman? To fall prostrate before a non-Roman? I don't think that's typical. It's not typical posture. I think a more typical thing would be, all right, hurry up, bind them up. Let's clean this up before I really get in trouble. Yeah.
From a Roman soldier's perspective, no doubt he's heard them pray. This may sound strange, but Romans were extremely religious people.
Very religious people.
So he's, and I'm throwing out a likely, possibly, a follower of Mars, or Mataru, or one of those guys. They're praying, he's heard them praying, and then suddenly they're freed from their bonds. I think, just speculation, he goes into them because these are, first off, strange people in Philippi. They're not Greek or Roman.
Right.
They're praying to God, and there's a response from God to them.
Yeah.
I see him looking at them going, he's favored.
Yeah.
So, in that sense, if they're able to talk to God, whether it's a Christian God or a pagan God, his thought is they're talking to God and God's responding.
Yeah, what's interesting, and I agree with that, what's interesting to me is Romans were infamous for getting people to recant their religion and to pronounce the Roman gods. And so this jailer, I mean, that's so ingrained in part of his DNA, very much like with us. It'd be like somebody coming in here and saying, hey, you know, I'm a Buddhist, and and you guys ought to follow suit. This is the truth. And say there was some earthquake or some earth-shattering event, literally. It still, in my mind, would make us be like, all right, let's kind of sort this out a little bit and think through. Like, we're logical thinkers. He doesn't do that. It's like this instant falling down and trembling before them. And the question that comes next, I think, is really, really fascinating, which I think shows the tremendous faith that this jailer had, and it shows his heart. This jailer was not, at least my assumption, he's not like a cold-hearted, awful human being, because he's willing to stick his neck on the line in many ways, and you'll see that in the text here. In every way possible, he's willing to stick his neck on the line, literally, for these people who he's never met before. Which I think shows the power of God. Dave and I were just talking before I came out. He was back in my office, and we were just talking about the power of prayer and how when you tap shoulders of other people and you pray together, it is absolutely breathtaking what God does and how He works on the hearts of people in ways that we can't ever explain. We can't put it into words. It's impossible. And I think that's exactly what's happening here. Verse 30, then he brought them out and said, sirs, I think that's interesting that he's calling them sirs. This guy has a lot of power. And he's fallen down before them, calling them sirs. Sirs, what must I do to be saved? And they said, believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household. And they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. And he took them the same hour of the night and washed their wounds and was baptized at once, he and all his family. So, I mean, so many rules are being broken here. We can't underestimate this.
Well, yes and no. Keep in mind, go back to the crucifixion of Jesus. When things begin to happen, what does the guard say there at Jesus? Surely he is the Son of God.
Yeah.
There's a recognition there are things, okay, we made a mistake. Obviously, in their point of view, with Jesus, you've got the darkness, you've got the earthquakes, and he's going, we've made a mistake. Mm-hmm. So when Jesus says, forgive them, they know not what they're doing, everybody thinks that's everybody. I don't.
I don't either.
I think that's the guards that are doing their lawful duty.
I agree.
When we come to the jailer, he does his lawful duty, but when he recognizes, and again, whether you claim Christian or pagan God, he recognizes the power of God. Mm-hmm. He then acts accordingly, because again, I can't stress this enough. The Romans, we always think of them as big, brutish, dumb people. They're very religious.
Yes.
We're going to throw out the top, the leadership of the Roman Empire, which I think you can usually do 99% of the time in governments. But when you're looking at him, he's not behaving in a way that violates his moral conscience or even his legal conscience, because he can point to these things occurred.
But I wonder about him bringing them into the home. Like, that's the part he brings them in the home, he's cleaning their wounds.
But he's still following the law.
Yeah.
And they're still under guard.
Yeah.
So how you guard is rather open in the Roman Empire.
Okay.
Keep in mind, when Paul's in Rome, he's got visitors coming in.
I guess that's true. Yeah, he's under house arrest.
Yeah.
And is still, yeah.
I mean, he can't go anywhere, and he's actually chained, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Roman justice is not quite what we have in our societies today.
Yeah.
And the jailer, he's got to kill himself because in Roman law, he has to take the place of the accused if they escape.
Yeah.
So his life would be over in every regard.
Yeah.
But he's still guarding them. He's still,
Yeah.
just because he's taking care of them doesn't mean he's not guarding them.
Yeah. Well, I think what's fascinating to me, and I think what's most important, is Paul and Silas and Luke, which Luke at this point is not mentioning himself a whole lot. He's using first person prior to this, and now it's kind of like he distances himself a little bit, which makes me kind of wonder in my own mind, and this, again, nobody knows, but I wonder if Luke was beaten or wasn't. I almost think he wasn't, because he's writing in a way where he's really distanced himself from Paul and Silas, almost like he feels an incredible amount of sympathy towards them. If you really look at the way that Luke's writing this, it's almost like they beat them in front of Luke and arrested all of them, put them in jail, because Luke's still writing as if he's there in the jail. The amount of details he's giving, it's like he really was there, but he distances himself from the other two. And I think that's really interesting. And I think that wouldn't be uncommon to beat people in front of, 2 out of the 3 as kind of a warning, Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's interesting. And then Paul and Silas's stance towards the jailer is nothing but compassionate. And at the end of the day, what's their mission? And I think that's what we really need to keep in mind. What's Paul and Silas's mission? Yeah. To anybody who will listen. Not to grow the church and to, really make the church strong and to go and, all the stuff that we focus on today. I think we got sidetracked from and forget what our mission is too. Their mission is our mission, to go and make disciples of all the nations, to preach the gospel to people, and to save people. And so he's so laser focused. They are so laser focused on that mission that they're doing their job. They're doing what they were set out to do. They were doing what they were commissioned to do. And I think it's just incredible. I think it's absolutely inspiring that they did it so successfully and were so focused even when they were to the point of death. And they baptized this jailer and his household. And then 34, he brought them up into his house and set food before them. And he rejoiced along with his entire household that he had believed in God. But when it was day, the magistrates sent the police, saying, "Let those men go." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore, come out now and go in peace." And I think the jailer meant nothing but well-being for them. I don't think the jailer's like, all right, we're going to kind of do the shady deal and, kind of sign on the dotted line. I don't think that at all. I think the jailer probably at this point still didn't know that Paul was a Roman citizen. Because Paul, if we go that alternative route, it was kind of irrelevant at this point. That was irrelevant to preaching the gospel to the jailer. And if you know Paul, when Paul has an active audience who Paul perceives to be even halfway attentive and halfway like they're going to receive the gospel, Paul will march right in, and Paul will be like, all right, let's get her done, you know? And I look at Ephesus, at the riot, 24,000 people crammed into the stadium shouting, "Great is Artemis of Ephesus." And Paul's like, his ears perk up, and he's like, oh, there's a lot of people in there. I'm going to go in and I'm going to preach. Like, they're chanting because they want him dead. And Paul's like, I'm going to go in and I'm going to preach the gospel to them. And it's his companions who finally yank him back, and they're like, Paul, you got to get out of here. And they sneak him out of Ephesus. They're like, they're going to kill you. And it took some convincing before Paul was finally like, all right. Like, I think he was probably mad at that point, like, but I want to preach to them. There are a few people in there who would come to Christ. I know it. I know this to be true. Like, I can picture Paul doing that. So Paul's going to preach to whoever's going to listen. And so this jailer comes in. He reports this to Paul. He says, therefore, go out now, go in peace. Verse 37, but Paul said to them, they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison, and they do now throw us out secretly? No. Let the magistrates, let them come themselves and take us out. The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. Uh-oh. Oops. So they came, I love this part. This is my favorite sentence, I think. So they came and apologized to them. That's pretty crazy. And they took them out and asked them to leave the city. So they went out of the prison and visited Lydia. And when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. Now, ESV has a footnote. It says, or brothers and sisters. This was kind of a common thing. You use the masculine plural, kind of like Spanish. If there's a group of guys and girls who are friends, you say amigos. That's masculine, plural, amigos. It's common when you have a mixed group of guys and girls, and this certainly in Greek, you would use the masculine plural. And so I don't think Paul turns away from the women and is like, all right, boys, he's clearly addressing everybody. And what's significant to me is that there's now an established church in Philippi, and they've been there for how long? Maybe. How long?
2 days.
Yeah, probably 48 hours. There's a church.
Well, you got the jailer and his...
Exactly right. You have Lydia and her household, the jailer and his household, and to our knowledge, they're really the only converts in all of Philippi, which would amount to approximately how many people? If we were to guess, how many people approximately?
Probably,
Yeah.
You're looking probably 20.
Yeah, max.
Jailer and
Max.
all the servants, etc.
Yeah, maximum 20 people. We get down on ourselves when we have 20 people here, and we're like, oh. Yeah, and I'm going to read during my sermon, I'm going to read something from Tom Rainer. I just saw this article, and it's fascinating to me. The definition for large church has now completely changed. And even Tom Rainer said, this is surprising to me. A large church now, if you're a large church, 250 and above is considered a large church. 5 years ago, 250 was not considered a large church. It's considered like a, small to medium sized church. Now that's defined as a large church is 250. And that only makes up, in the United States, 250 and above only makes up 8% of all churches across all denominations. And so what's interesting to me, and it's and actually a little bit exciting, is that I think there's a shift towards small group mentality. There's strength in numbers, but there's strength in smaller numbers, more intimate groups. And so you have this church in Philippi who starts, Paul's in and out in 48 hours. There's now an established church. He goes, he encourages them. Clearly not a lot of instruction. In 48 hours, I'm sorry, and half of that time you're locked up in bars and you're beaten to the point of you're so near death. This isn't like this well-trained, thriving, like they know exactly what we're going to put our mission statement up on the board and we know what this church is about and we're a strong church plant and we're going to go and we're going to get funding and we have a preacher and they have none of that. This is a group of brand new people, part Jews, who've been worshiping by this river. They don't even have a building. They don't have men. And now you have a Roman jailer, completely pagan, wildly pagan, and his household, and now they're this blended group of brand new Christians. And Paul and his companions are forced out of Philippi, and they move on to the next town. From our perspective, we look at that and we're like, that church doesn't stand a chance. And that's the background that I think is important, because Paul now is writing this letter to the church in Philippi. There's a very significant church that's been planted and rooted in Philippi, not only in Paul's time, but there are a lot of writings and several letters that are written by bishops, elders in this region who are writing about this significant church, or writing to this significant church in Philippi. Very, very significant church that's in Philippi. So I think it's just interesting. Again, I'll close on this, but it's a fascinating way for how God works, and I think we're the ones who limit God. And we're like, oh, we don't have the resources, and we don't have the manpower, we don't have the people, we don't have this, we don't have that, people aren't interested, people aren't engaged, people aren't excited, and it's to the point where I think God is up there just shaking his head, saying, just work, and I will take care of the rest. Like it's not that difficult. Just work, and I'll do the rest. And clearly he did that in Philippi.
And I think the other thing that we're totally missing is there's actually a good foundation for the church in Philippi. Those Jewish women who accepted the gospel understood the transition from Old Covenant to New Covenant.
Yeah.
You know, that they're not without knowledge.
Yeah.
So when you bring in the pagans, I can't help but think of Corinth when Paul writes to them in 1 Corinthians and says, you ought to know by now to quit going to the pagan temples.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Paul didn't even think that was worth covering in Corinth because they had so many other issues.
Yeah.
Here, he's not doing any issues. I think there's a good foundation. There may not be many Jewish women,
yeah,
but they're there and they've got the knowledge.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, and we're talking, I'm going to say something terrible here now, but I have a feeling they were teaching the men.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah, it is very fascinating. And I think we put so many limits on God, and you know, we let our preferences take over 9 3/4 of the time out of 10. We'll be like, well, this is what I would do or not do, and this offends me, and like if I had $1 for every time I've heard the phrase, well, this offends me. good for you. You know what I mean? Like, they weren't worried about what offended and didn't offend people. They were worried about mission. And the mission was, go out and give the gospel to anybody who will listen, no matter what circumstance. And they did that, and God took care of the rest. So pretty cool stuff, but I'm out of time. I'm going to stop there. I don't know if I'm teaching next week or not. Brent, I think, will be back, but I'm going to be ready to go, but we'll see. We don't know yet. So if not, when I come back, we'll finish up Philippians and get into the letter, because it's so cool. There's so much going on there. All right, thanks, guys.